The year of the Iron Frost, 1816. The Hook. June 4th, 1816, Vermont, USA. The sun rose, but it was a ghostly, bruised purple. By noon, a terrifying black cloud swept across the Green Mountains, and instead of a summer rain, a violent blizzard descended. 6 inches of snow buried the budding corn. Birds froze mid-air and dropped like stones into the mud. In a world without internet or global news, the pioneers of New England thought the apocalypse had arrived. Little did they know, 10,000 miles away, a mountain had exploded and the ash was coming to starve them all. The sun without a soul. Elias Sterling wiped the sweat from his brow, but it wasn't the sweat of heat, it was the cold perspiration of fear. He stood on his small farm in the heart of Vermont, clutching a handful of dirt that should have been warm with the promise of June. Instead, it was as cold as a gravestone. Behind him, his wife, Sarah, stood in the doorway of their log cabin, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She watched the horizon. For 3 months, the sun had been a pale, sickly disk, obscured by a dry red haze that no wind could blow away. "Elias," she called, her voice trembling. "The water trough? It froze again. Solid." Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. He was looking at his cornfield. Yesterday, the stalks were 6 inches high, vibrant and green. This morning, they were black, shriveled by a frost that had no business existing in the summertime. In 1816, the United States was a young nation, full of hope and expansion. But in this year, nature had turned into an enemy. History would later call it 1800 and froze to death. The fire in the distance. While Elias and Sarah struggled to understand why their world was dying, the answer lay half a world away in the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. 1 year prior, in April 1815, Mount Tambora had undergone the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded human history. The explosion was so massive it was heard 1,600 miles away. It ejected 150 cubic kilometers of ash, dust, and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. This invisible veil of volcanic winter was now circling the globe, reflecting the sun's heat back into space. The Earth was suffocating under a blanket of its own debris. But for the American settlers, there were no scientists to explain this. There were only the empty granaries, the dying livestock, and the terrifying sermons in the village churches claiming that the day of judgment was at hand. The hunger and the road. By July, the situation turned from strange to deadly. In the markets of Boston and Albany, the price of grains skyrocketed. A bushel of corn that once cost a few cents was now worth more than a man's daily labor. Families began to do the unthinkable to survive. "We can't stay, Sarah," Elias said one evening, the light of a single tallow candle flickering between them. They had just finished a meal of boiled nettles and a handful of moldy rye. "The frost took the wheat, it took the oats. If we stay through the winter, we'll be burying our children before the first real thaw." They weren't alone. Thousands of New Englanders were looking toward the west. Rumors were spreading of a place called the Ohio Country, where people whispered the frost hadn't reached and the soil was still black and rich. This was the birth of the Ohio fever. It wasn't just a desire for more land. It was a desperate flight from a climate that had turned murderous. The Dark Harvest and the Hedgehog. As Elias and Sarah pushed their wagon through the muddy trails of Pennsylvania, they realized that hunger was a more dangerous enemy than the cold. In August, another frost hit, thick as a winter blanket. The remaining crops across the Northeast turned to mush. They came across a village where the church bells were ringing, not for a wedding or a funeral, but for a prayer for warmth. The townspeople were desperate. Elias saw a man trading a silver family heirloom for a single loaf of bread. "We have to find the hedgehog people," a fellow traveler told Elias over a campfire of damp, smoking wood. "Hedgehog people?" Elias asked, sheltering Sarah from the biting wind. "The settlers in the high hills. They've survived by eating nothing but hedgehogs and wild leeks. They say they've found a way to bake bread out of ground-up birch bark and sawdust." The desperation was turning into a grim science. People were learning to eat what they once walked over. The Sterlings had to learn fast. Elias spent his nights hunting by the pale, hazy moonlight, his fingers so cold he could barely pull the trigger of his flintlock. The Dark Inspiration. While the common folk struggled to find bread, the year without a summer was changing the world in ways no one expected. Far away in Switzerland, a group of young writers, including Mary Shelley and Lord Byron, were trapped inside a villa because the weather was too foul to go outside. To pass the time, they challenged each other to write the scariest story they could imagine. Influenced by the gloom, the constant darkness, and the feeling that nature had turned against man, Mary Shelley began writing Frankenstein. The monster was born from the same volcanic ash that was starving Elias's children. Back in America, a young man named Joseph Smith in Vermont saw his family's crops fail 3 years in a row due to the erratic weather. Bankrupt and desperate, the Smith family moved to New York. This move directly led to the founding of the Mormon faith. The volcano was not just killing crops, it was shifting the very foundations of human culture and religion. The crossing into Ohio. By late September, the Sterlings reached the banks of the Ohio River. The air here was slightly warmer, the suffocating ash clouds seemingly thinner. But the river was a chaotic scene. Thousands of wagons were lined up, waiting for ferries. People were shouting, horses were screaming, and the smell of wood smoke was everywhere. "Is this the promised land, Pa?" his young son Thomas asked, looking at the dark water. Elias looked at the thousands of other families. He saw the same exhaustion in their eyes, but also the same iron will. They were the survivors. They had lived through a summer where the sun died, and they were still standing. "It's a new start, son. The earth will wake up again. We just have to be here when it does." The historical aftermath. The year 1816 changed America forever. It accelerated the settlement of the American Midwest, turning Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois into the new heartland. It taught the pioneers that survival required more than just hard work. It required a community that could withstand the impossible. When the sun finally returned to its full strength in 1817, the people who emerged from the iron frost were different. They were tougher, more resilient, and forever wary of the sky. The architecture of survival. The New West was not the paradise the flyers in Vermont had promised. It was a dense, ancient forest of oak and walnut that had never seen an axe. But for Elias, the lack of frost on the ground felt like a miracle. The first task was the sod and log house. In the American frontier, your house was your fortress against the elements. Elias and a few other men he met on the trail, men from New Hampshire and Connecticut, formed a raising bee. This was a quintessential American tradition where strangers became brothers through shared labor. They didn't just build a house, they built a smokehouse and a root cellar. The cellar was dug deep into the earth, lined with stones. "If the sun disappears again," Elias told Sarah, "we will have the earth's own heat to keep our potatoes from turning to stone." The strange myths of the ash. During those long, dark nights in the new settlement, around the communal fires, a new kind of American folklore was being born. Without science to explain the volcanic winter, the settlers created legends to make sense of the misery. They spoke of the ice phantom, a spirit that breathed on the crops to turn them to glass. Some claimed that the sun had rusted because of the sins of the nation. There were stories of the ghost corn, fields that looked gold in the moonlight but turned to dust when touched. These myths became a part of the American psyche, a deep-seated fear of the power of nature that remains in rural American culture to this day. It was a time when the line between reality and nightmare was as thin as the ice on the river. The return of the gold. Spring of 1817 arrived differently. The red haze had finally thinned. The sulfur from Mount Tambora had washed out of the sky and into the soil. One morning in May, Sarah walked out to the small garden she had planted behind their new cabin. She knelt and touched the soil. It was warm, truly warm. "Elias, Thomas, come quickly!" They ran out to find her pointing at a tiny green sprout. It wasn't the sickly pale green of the previous year. It was deep, vibrant, and strong. For the first time in 2 years, the cycle of life had resumed. The year without a summer was over, but it had left its mark. The Sterlings were no longer just farmers. They were pioneers. They had survived the closest thing to an apocalypse their world had ever seen.
The Iron Pulse, the greatest race on Earth. In 1860, it took 6 months of life-threatening travel to get from New York to San Francisco. You either braved the desert and Native American war parties, or you sailed around the deadly tip of South America. But 2 companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, were about to change that. They were given a simple, brutal challenge. Start from opposite ends of the continent and build a railroad until you meet. The prize? Millions of dollars in land and the future of the United States. This wasn't just construction, it was a war of hammers. The Mad Dreamer. The story begins with Theodore Judah, a man the locals called Crazy Judah. He was obsessed with finding a way for a train to climb the Sierra Nevada, a granite wall of mountains that everyone else said was impassable. Judah spent years in the wilderness, mapping every cliff and canyon. He eventually convinced 4 Sacramento merchants, later known as the Big Four, to fund him. On the other side of the country, President Abraham Lincoln, in the middle of the bloody Civil War, signed the Pacific Railroad Act. He knew that to keep California in the Union, he needed to bind the country with iron. The 2 armies. The race was on. The Union Pacific, starting from Omaha, Nebraska, they moved west across the flat Great Plains. Their workforce was a gritty mix of Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans. They were fast, but they faced constant raids and the lawlessness of hell on wheels, temporary towns that sprung up at the end of the tracks, filled with saloons, gambling, and outlaws. The Central Pacific, starting from Sacramento, California, faced the mountains immediately. White laborers refused to do the backbreaking work, so the company hired thousands of Chinese immigrants. These men became the backbone of the railroad, working in sub-zero temperatures and handling volatile explosives that their white counterparts wouldn't touch. The Granite Wall. While the Union Pacific was flying across the plains, the Central Pacific was moving at a snail's pace, sometimes only inches a day.
They had to carve 15 tunnels through solid granite. The Chinese workers were lowered in wicker baskets down 1,000-foot cliffs. Suspended in midair, they drilled holes into the rock, stuffed them with nitroglycerin, which was 10 times more unstable than dynamite, lit the fuse, and pulled themselves up as fast as possible. Many didn't make it. The mountains were literally being hollowed out by hand and black powder.
10 miles in one day. As the two lines grew closer in the desert of Utah, the rivalry turned into a legendary bet. The Union Pacific mocked the Central Pacific for being slow. In response, the Central Pacific crew performed a feat that has never been repeated. They laid 10 miles and 56 feet of track in a single 12-hour shift. They laid 3,520 rails and spiked 28,160 times. By the end of the day, the men had lifted a total of 1.9 million pounds of iron. The Union Pacific stopped laughing. The Wedding of the Rails. On May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, the two engines, the Jupiter and number 1119, stood pilot to pilot. A final spike made of solid gold was placed in a tie of polished laurel wood. The telegraph wires were connected to the spike and the hammer. Every major city in America was waiting. When the hammer hit the spike, the word "done" was flashed instantly across the nation. It was the first live mass media event in history. Liberty bells rang in Philadelphia. Cannons fired in New York. The journey that used to take 6 months now took 6 days. The liquid fire, the nitroglycerin war. In the race through the mountains, the Central Pacific faced a problem. Black powder wasn't strong enough to break the Sierra Nevada's granite. They needed something more violent. They turned to a newly discovered chemical, nitroglycerin. It was a nightmare in liquid form. It was so unstable that a single drop spilled on a floor could blow a building apart. The railroad companies started manufacturing it on site because shipping it was too dangerous. One story tells of a nitro man who tripped while carrying 2 jugs. He disappeared in a flash of light so bright it was seen for miles. There was nothing left to bury. Despite the terror, the Chinese workers mastered the liquid fire. They used it to blast the Summit Tunnel, a feat of engineering that experts in London and Paris said was physically impossible. The Credit Mobilier Scandal, the Great Theft. While the workers were dying in the mountains, the executives in New York and Washington were stealing. The Union Pacific didn't make its money from passengers. It made its money from the government. The directors created a fake construction company called Credit Mobilier. They then hired themselves to build the railroad at double the actual cost. They bribed dozens of U.S. congressmen with stock to keep the tax dollars flowing. When the truth finally came out in 1872, it nearly brought down the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. It was the largest financial scandal in American history up to that point, proving that the railroad was built on a foundation of both iron and corruption. The Hell on Wheels towns. As the Union Pacific pushed across the plains of Nebraska and Wyoming, a strange phenomenon followed them: Hell on Wheels. These were pop-up towns made of tents and wood shacks. Whenever the tracks reached a certain point, a town would be born overnight. It was filled with gambling halls, where a soldier's wages disappeared in an hour. Saloons, serving rot-gut whiskey that could blind a man. Outlaws, men like Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane, moved through these shadows. Every night, these towns were a blur of violence and music. Every morning, the town would be packed up onto flat cars and moved 20 miles further west to follow the tracks. Today, cities like Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Laramie
exist only because they started as these lawless moving camps. The forgotten giant, the Chinese strike. History often ignores that the Chinese workers, over 10,000 of them, once organized the largest labor strike in American history at that time. In June 1867, fed up with being paid less than white workers and being forced into the most dangerous jobs, they simply stopped. They laid down their shovels in the high Sierras and demanded equality. The railroad bosses were furious. They tried to starve the workers out by cutting off food supplies in the mountains. While the strike only lasted a week, it proved that the men who were building the dream knew their own worth. They eventually returned to work with a small raise, but they had sent a message. The iron cannot move without us. The Winter of the White Death, 1866 to 1867. While the Union Pacific was enjoying the flat, easy plains of Nebraska, the Central Pacific workers, mostly Chinese, were trapped in the worst winter in recorded history in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Snow fell in layers up to 40 feet deep, but the railroad bosses didn't stop the work. The Chinese laborers were forced to live and work under the snow. They dug a vast network of ice tunnels beneath the snowdrifts to reach the mountain faces they were blasting. Imagine working 12-hour shifts in a dark, freezing tunnel made of ice, knowing that at any moment an avalanche could bury your entire camp. Hundreds of workers were swept away by silent walls of snow. Their bodies weren't found until the following spring, still clutching their shovels and pickaxes. They were literally frozen in time, the silent martyrs of the American dream. The Iron Horse versus the Great Spirit. As the Union Pacific pushed into the Wyoming Territory, they entered the sacred hunting grounds of the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations. To the Native Americans, the locomotive was a smoke monster that screamed across their land and brought thousands of white settlers who killed the buffalo, their primary food source. The conflict was inevitable. War parties began tearing up the tracks. They would wait for a train to pass, then wrap chains around the rails and pull them out of alignment using horses. When the next train crashed, the warriors would attack. The U.S. Army had to be called in, turning the construction site into a moving battlefield. Every mile of track laid in the West was paid for in blood. The Battle of the Grades, the fake race. As the two companies got closer in Utah, something ridiculous happened. The government had promised to pay the companies for every mile of track they laid. To make more money, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific refused to meet. Instead of connecting the tracks, they started building parallel to each other. For over 100 miles, the two crews were working side by side, sometimes just a few hundred feet apart, moving in opposite directions. The crews began a sabotage war. The Union Pacific workers, mostly Irish, would set off explosions near the Central Pacific workers, mostly Chinese. The Chinese workers responded by timing their blasts to bury the Irish crews under rock. This went on for months until the government realized the scam and forced them to choose a meeting point, Promontory Summit. The last spike and the telegraph heard round the world. The day of the connection, May 10, 1869, was the 19th century's version of the moon landing. The two massive steam engines, the Jupiter and the number 119, moved so close their cowcatchers touched. A special spike made of 17.6 karat gold was driven into a tie of polished California laurel. But here is a detail most people don't know. The wealthy bosses, Leland Stanford and Thomas Durant, both tried to hit the golden spike with a silver hammer, and they both missed. The crowd laughed, but the telegraph operator didn't care. He tapped out the word D-O-N-E to every city in America. In San Francisco, they fired 100 cannons. In New York, the bells of Trinity Church rang. The continent was finally, irrevocably, won. The birth of the outlaw era. Before the railroad, if you robbed a stagecoach, you got a bag of mail and maybe a few gold watches. But the trains? The trains were moving vaults. They carried massive shipments of gold from the California mines and payroll for the U.S. Army. This created a new breed of American criminal, the train robber. Enter Jesse James and the James Younger Gang. In 1873, they performed the first train robbery in the West. They didn't just stop the train, they loosened the rails on a blind curve in Adair, Iowa, causing the massive engine to topple over like a dying beast. As the steam hissed and the engineers lay dazed, the outlaws stepped out of the shadows with masks over their faces and revolvers drawn. The Great Buffalo Slaughter. The railroad brought a tragedy that would change the American landscape forever. To the U.S. government, the millions of buffalo, or bison, roaming the plains were an obstacle to the tracks and a source of strength for the Native American tribes. The railroad companies started offering hunting excursions. Wealthy travelers would sit in the luxury velvet seats of the train, open the windows, and shoot at the herds with high-powered rifles as the train moved. They didn't even stop to take the meat. In less than 20 years, the buffalo population went from 30 million to less than 1,000. This wasn't just hunting, it was biological warfare. By destroying the buffalo, the railroad effectively forced the Native American tribes onto reservations because their source of food, clothing, and shelter was gone. The Pinkertons, America's first shadow police. The railroad companies were now more powerful than some state governments, and they wanted protection. Since there was no FBI yet, they hired the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. The Pinkertons were a private army. Their logo was an unblinking eye with the slogan, "We never sleep." They became the shadows following every outlaw. If you robbed a train, the Pinkertons would track you for thousands of miles, across borders and through mountains. This led to the famous Wild West shootouts. The Pinkertons were often just as violent as the criminals they hunted. They used dynamite to blow up the homes of suspected outlaws, sometimes killing innocent family members, which only made folk heroes out of criminals like Jesse James in the eyes of the public. The death of the frontier. By the 1880s, the railroad had done the impossible. It had killed the frontier. With the trains came barbed wire. Before the railroad, the West was open range, where cowboys could drive cattle for thousands of miles. But the trains brought farmers, and the farmers brought barbed wire to protect their land. The cowboy era, which is so famous in Hollywood movies, actually only lasted about 20 years. The railroad brought the very thing that cowboys hated: fences, taxes, and law. The ghost towns left behind by the iron horse. While the railroad breathed life into cities like Chicago and San Francisco, it also acted as a grim reaper for hundreds of others. In the vast American desert, a town's heart beat only as long as the train stopped there. If a railroad company decided to straighten the line to save fuel, or if a silver mine dried up and the tracks were pulled, a bustling city of 5,000 people could become a graveyard in months. Today, across the American West, travelers find these ghost towns. You can walk into an abandoned saloon in Bodie or Rhyolite and see dust-covered bottles still on the bar. These are the silent monuments to the volatility of the rail era, reminders that in the rush for progress, the iron horse was as quick to abandon a community as it was to build it. The ghost signals and the phantom trains. While the history books focus on the steel, the steam, and the gold, The workers who built the lines whispered of something else, something that defied the laws of physics. With thousands of men dying in explosions, blizzards, and riots during construction, the Transcontinental Railroad became a 2,000-mile graveyard. Soon, the legends of the phantom trains began to take root in the American psyche. The Headless Signalman of Mako. One of the most enduring legends is the Mako Light. According to railway lore, a conductor named Joe Baldwin was decapitated in a horrific collision in 1867. For decades afterward, engineers reported seeing a single swaying lantern light floating along the tracks at night. Train after train would screech to a halt, the engineers certain they were about to hit a man on the tracks. But as they climbed down from their cabs, the light would simply vanish into the swamp mist. It became so frequent that the Atlantic coastline issued official orders to its engineers. If you see a single light at Mako, do not stop. It is not a man. The Morning Train of Abraham Lincoln. Perhaps the most famous ghost train in U.S. history is the funeral train of Abraham Lincoln. Every year in April, people in New York and Ohio claimed to see a black-draped locomotive moving silently through the night. Witnesses described the air turning cold as the passed. They claimed the clocks in the nearby stations would stop exactly as the ghost engine whistled. It was as if the nation's grief was so heavy that the train was destined to repeat its mournful journey across the tracks forever. The Great Circus Wreck, 1893. The railroad didn't just carry coal and passengers, it carried the extraordinary. In 1893, a massive circus train belonging to the Sells brothers was traveling through Iowa when the air brakes failed on a steep grade. What followed was a scene out of a fever dream. The train derailed, smashing into a valley. But it wasn't just wreckage, it was a prison break for the exotic. In the middle of the dark Iowa night, local farmers woke to the sounds of tigers roaring in the cornfields and elephants trumpeting in the woods. For weeks, the American Midwest felt like a jungle. This event highlighted the bizarre risks of the rail. At any moment, the modern world could collide with the wild, leaving a trail of chaos behind. The corporate war for the Royal Gorge. If the ghosts didn't get you, the lawyers and mercenaries would. In 1878, a literal war broke out between two rival companies, the Rio Grande and the Santa Fe, over a narrow 1,000-foot deep canyon in Colorado known as the Royal Gorge. The canyon was so narrow that there was only room for one set of tracks. Instead of going to court, the companies hired private armies. They built stone forts on the cliffs and began a stone war, dropping massive boulders onto the workers below. They blew up each other's bridges and hijacked locomotives at gunpoint. It was the ultimate Wild West corporate showdown. It eventually took the United States Supreme Court and a literal peace treaty to end the fighting. This proved that in the Gilded Age of America, the railroad was more than a business. It was a kingdom worth killing for. The Moving Palaces of George Pullman. After the tracks were joined, the journey was no longer just about survival. It was about status. George Pullman, a shrewd businessman, realized that the wealthy elite of New York and San Francisco would pay a fortune to travel in luxury. He created the Pullman sleeping car. These were not ordinary train cars. They were masterpieces of Victorian design. The interiors, lavish wood carvings, velvet curtains, crystal chandeliers, and silver wash basins. The experience, for the first time, you could eat a 5-course meal on fine china while moving at 40 miles per hour across the desert. But the real secret to the Pullman empire wasn't the silk or the silver. It was the Pullman porters. The Pullman porters and the birth of the black middle class. Pullman specifically recruited formerly enslaved African Americans to work as porters. He wanted men who were trained in the high service of the Old South. These men became the face of the railroad. They shined shoes, made beds with military precision, and anticipated every whim of the wealthy passengers. However, they were treated with extreme disrespect. Passengers often called every porter George after George Pullman, stripping them of their individual names. Despite the low pay and long hours, sometimes 20 hours a day, these men did something extraordinary. They saved their tips, bought homes, and sent their children to universities. The Pullman porters became the foundation of the black middle class in America. They were the information highway, carrying newspapers and ideas from the progressive North to the segregated South, quietly fueling the early seeds of the civil rights movement. The Harvey Girls, the women who civilized the West. While the porters handled the trains, a man named Fred Harvey realized that the food at train stops was garbage. In the early days, passengers were often served rancid meat in dirty shacks. Harvey opened a chain of high-end restaurants along the Santa Fe line and hired the Harvey Girls. These were young, educated women from the East who were of good character. They moved to the wild, dusty towns of Arizona and New Mexico, wearing crisp white aprons and black dresses. They brought a sense of order and Eastern culture to the lawless West. Many of these women ended up marrying local ranchers and miners, becoming the matriarchs of new Western towns. In the history of the USA, it is often said that while the cowboys won the West, the Harvey Girls and the Pullman porters civilized it. The sunset of the steam giant. By the early 20th century, the railroad was the undisputed king, but a new invention was quietly idling in a garage in Detroit, the Model T Ford. As the automobile and eventually the airplane began to take over, the great transcontinental lines began to fade. The massive steam engines, the 400-ton big boys, were slowly moved to museums. The small towns that lived and died by the train whistle began to shrink. The great train robbery that changed law enforcement. By the late 1890s, the railroad was the juggernaut of American commerce, moving massive amounts of gold, currency, and bonds across the desolate plains. But this concentration of wealth created a magnet for the most dangerous men in the West. The era of the lone rider was ending, and the era of the organized criminal gang was beginning. The most famous of these was Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch. The Wilcox Robbery, June 2, 1899. In the pitch-black early hours near Wilcox, Wyoming, the Wild Bunch pulled off a heist that would become legend. They didn't just stop the Union Pacific Overland Flyer. They used so much dynamite to blow open the safe that the entire express car was shredded into splinters. Cash and gold rained down on the tracks. As the outlaws galloped away into the hole-in-the-wall pass with $30,000, over $1 million today, they thought they had escaped. In the past, a sheriff's posse would chase them to the county line and stop, but the railroad changed the rules of the chase. The rise of the super posse. The Union Pacific Railroad was tired of being a victim. They didn't just call the local police, they funded a special service of the Pinkerton Agency. This was the birth of modern multi-state law enforcement. The Pinkertons used the railroad's own technology against the bandits. The telegraph. Before the outlaws could reach the next town, their descriptions were already there. Special trains. The railroad kept posse cars ready, trains loaded with fresh horses and elite manhunters. These trains could drop a fully equipped cavalry 100 miles ahead of the fleeing outlaws. The death of the outlaw myth. This shift marked a turning point in American history. The Wild West was being tamed not just by the gun alone, but by logistics, communication, and corporate power. The tactics developed to protect the trains, tracking criminals across state lines, and using centralized data laid the direct groundwork for what would eventually become the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI.